certainly, of course, many of you remember Michael heard me speak at a Toastmaster conference. I invited him and now he's a member. And during the day and most evenings, Michael is building bridges to bring Japan and Silicon Valley closer together. He has a strong understanding of the Japanese and American culture and language, having been raised bowing to his parents and educated in America. After spending 2 decades in executive management roles in tech companies, in 2004, Michael started his consulting profession. Until a year ago, his business had him flying back and forth across the world. Now, like the rest of us, he's zooming around. As we know, Michael is heavily involved with the Japanese American Museum in San Jose. In 2011, Michael joined the board and managed public programs before becoming board president in 2017. His attraction to being actively involved with the museum is the opportunity to give back to the local community. He is embarrassed to tell us, like most students, he never learned much about the Japanese American experience. He is the first to admit, I've learned more from the internees who visit the museum than I will ever read. Michael also serves in boards of the Japanese Chamber of Commerce in Northern California and the Japanese Community Congress of San Jose. Please welcome our very own member, Michael Sera. Take it away, Michael.
Hey, Michael. Good morning, Breakfast Clevers. By show of hands, how many of you have been to Japantown? I've taken quite a few of you. So what I'd like to talk about today is, why is Japantown important? Well, there are 3 reasons. The first is the history, the second is the culture, and the third is the future. Many of you joined us last week when Edward Siegel talked about the 10 R's of crisis management. Do you recall what the 10th R was? Remember. In his example, he spoke about paying attention to how other companies respond to a crisis. What I hope to teach and what I hope to talk about today is how the Japanese and the Japanese Americans dealt with the crisis. Second, culture. It's important for us to embrace our diversity. I think it's what makes San Francisco what it is today. It's the embracing of the different diversities that we have. Joel Panzer, you have a great quote on the Golden Gate Breakfast website. Golden Gate Breakfast Club is a definition of hospitality where accomplished professionals warmly welcome people of diverse backgrounds and life experiences. And then the future. We talk about, how do we preserve Japantown? Well, I call it succession planning and make sure that we have youth that are ready to take over when it's time. So let me go back into some of the history. It starts in 1868. It's called the Meiji Restoration. And like all of our ancestors, there was a reason why we all immigrated to the US. And in Japan's case, it was economically driven. If you look back in history, 1868 is a pivotal time when the rulership changed from the samurai to the imperial. And it's when Commander Perry started opening up the trade channel between the US and Japan. He brought technology to Japan and the imperial family embraced it. At that time, the technology was the machine gun. So imagine all these Japanese samurai are running up over the hill, and then the imperial family is waiting for them with their new technology. That's when the capital actually moved from Kyoto to Tokyo and where it resides today. If you know Asian families, it's typically the #1 son that inherits everything. Number 2 and number 3 are not so lucky. So at this time, all this turmoil is going on. Number 2 and number 3 son are thinking, what am I going to do next? And that's when they look at other places to go. At the same time, the US had just passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So they were short of labor. So the 2 countries got together, agreed, and they started allowing immigration to happen. First stop, Hawaii. Over time, Seattle, San Francisco, and then eventually LA. And this continued on until all of a sudden there were too many of these black-haired, brown-eyed people coming into the US, and folks were getting a little worried. And so they passed a law called the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, which stopped issuing passports to laborers. They did, however, welcome family members, and that was great and all, but most of these folks that came over were single. And this is way, way before the internet. So none of this eHarmony or Match.com was available. So they had to use the old letter and postcards and send them back and forth with pictures. And somebody would introduce their buddy to a girl and say, hey, I've got this girl back home you should meet. So they'd send pictures, letters back and forth, and then get married on a proxy and finally take the trip over. And so these women would actually come over on a boat and meet their husbands for the first time on a pier. And that continued on from 1908 to about 1924 when the Asian Exclusion Act kicked in. And that's when no further immigration to the US was allowed. So what happens? All of a sudden, everybody goes to the South. And so if you go to Peru and Brazil today, you'll find the largest population of Japanese outside of Japan in those two countries. And then, of course, they went to the north in Canada. Today, we only have 3 Japantowns, but at one time, there was more than 50 all throughout the US. San Francisco, of course, most of you know, San Jose, and then LA. I grew up in a city, as most of you know, and spent my days in San Francisco, went to high school there, and I still remember the cherry blossom festivals where we would sell shumai and calipus. Something about the name didn't really strike people, and so they had to change the name. Imagine that. But if you guys know the history, Japantown was actually split into 2 before the earthquake. There was one just outside of Chinatown and one south of Market. After the earthquake, they combined and resettled into Post and Buchanan, where it is today. And at the peak, there was about 11,500 Japanese Americans residing in Japantown. Next is LA. They call it Little Tokyo, a much larger footprint, about 30,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. Today, there's about 37,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans residing there. Again, a much bigger footprint, and they have a Japanese American National Museum. If you're ever down there, I encourage you to go visit. And they also have a monument, Go for Broke, and I'll speak to this a little later. Last but not least is my favorite, and I am a little biased, is our own San Jose Japantown. Last year, they celebrated their 130th anniversary. And why I feel that this is probably one of the most authentic of the 3 Japantowns is that we still have families that have been in the business for 3, 4 generations now, and they still have their business going on in Japantown. Now, people ask, why did they settle here in this area? Well, if you go back in history, it was Chinatown that was actually here first. This was the 3rd Chinatown that they had developed in San Jose. The first 2 were mysteriously burned down. And this 3rd one, a kind gentleman named Highland actually leased the land to the Chinese. And so they called this area Highlandville. They actually erected a fence around this community to save it from being burned down a 3rd time, and they succeeded. So back in that time, there's a lot of racial tension. And what the Japanese realized was it wasn't easy to just plop themselves down anywhere in San Jose, but they could coexist with other Asians. Lo and behold, Chinatown was there. So the Japanese started to settle near them. Second reason they also settled here was day labor. Every morning, the farmers would come in, pick up a truckload of these farmers, take them out to their farms, work on a day and drop them back off. So during the peak of the season, typically spring and summer, there'd be 3,000 seasonal workers that come into the Japantown community. And that is one of the reasons why it flourished here. Today, there's about 11,500 Japanese and Japanese Americans residing here. And there are big pockets of other Japanese immigrants because of the tech industry in Silicon Valley. So you'll find them in Mountain View, Palo Alto, Cupertino, Sunnyvale. The center of Japantown in San Jose is here at 5th and Jackson. And just down the street off of 5th is where the Japanese American Museum is. And when the pandemic's over, I hope to welcome you all back. Now, we talk about immigrating here to the US. What did they do? A lot of it was in agriculture. And if you can see from this picture, the picture down below is strawberry farming. You have to remember the Japanese were doing rice paddies, and so they're used to bending over and doing this very labor-intense work. So to them, strawberries was actually easy because they didn't have to wade in water anymore. Well, that success also brought on some challenges. At the peak, this is in the 1940s now, at the peak, there were 2% of the overall population on the West Coast, and they had amassed 60% of the produce market. At the same time, Hawaii had 150,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. On the West Coast, that 2% number represented 112,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. Inland, there were another 10,000. So fairly major footprints throughout the US. But that tension I talked about earlier with the 60% market share created this hostility between the American farmers' unions. And they started complaining to the government that we'd love when the Japanese first came here, but now they've taken over markets, we'd like them to go home. The problem is they were home. And so that hostility continued until December of 41, when the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, and all hell broke loose. This is when the farming unions went back to the government and said, look how bad these Japanese people are, as a blanket statement. And Roosevelt had to do something. And so he put in place Executive Order 9066 3 months later. And that is what force removed 112,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans off the West Coast inland. And I would argue that this was economically and politically driven. And the reason why was, remember that number of Hawaii Japanese and Japanese Americans? 150,000. And remember where Pearl Harbor is. Yet, how many of those folks were actually interned? The number is 1,800, as opposed to 112,000 on the West Coast. What was the difference? There was a War Relocation Authority, WRA, person who was responsible for the West Coast, who had the ear of the farming unions. And he was hearing all of this. And so he was forced to do some action. Hawaii also had a different WRA authority. And he knew the Japanese and Japanese Americans. They were friends. They worked together. That 150,000 also represented a third of the population of the Hawaiian Islands. And he knew if he had put those folks in and incarcerated them, the whole island would come to a freezing halt. And he also trusted them, and he spoke up for them and said, I will take responsibility. I will take responsibility for these people. Leave them alone. And so they did. And they only captured 1,800 of those folks who were leaders, either a teacher, preacher, government official, and put them into what they call Department of Justice camps. These were set aside for those folks that the FBI had been tracking who felt were of threat. And so, irregardless of location, Hawaii, West Coast, inland, they picked up and rounded these folks up the day after Pearl Harbor. So these things all lead for me to believe that it was, again, historically, economic and politically driven. Another fact, you won't read a lot of these things, but a fact that I heard about was that folks on the West Coast, if they had a sponsor, in many cases, families that were inland, give you an example of Colorado, who would support you, you could move in advance to Colorado and live there freely. Folks that moved with the government afterwards were put into a camp called Camp Amachi. And the only difference between the folks living outside a camp and those living inside a camp was the time they arrived and how they arrived there. Another example, if you're a college bound and you had a sponsor, you could go to college on the East Coast and never go to camp. The basic rule was get out of California, get out of the West Coast. They wanted to reclaim the land. And that's the reason why I say it was politically and economically driven. When we say camp, this is what we're talking about. It was basically a prison. This was surrounded by barbed wire fences with guard towers with machine gun armed soldiers. And the scary thing about this was they were told that this was a place that they were going to take them for their safety. Well, if it's for your safety, the guard tower should be on the inside of the fences, not on the outside. And the gun should be pointing outside, not inside. But that was the case. The guard towers were outside. All the guns were pointing in. And so you have to ask yourself, really, what was it for? Well, the Japanese persevere, and there's a word we call gama, which is to put up with it. And so they went on their daily lives. They continued to farm. And of course, they tried to make the best of it. And they brought in poultry as well as hogs. But what really is amazing about all of this is that there were a large group of young men and women who actually volunteered and served in the US military. There were roughly 3,000 from Hawaii that served in the 100th, and another 1,500 that came from the camps themselves. Now, their parents are being interned, and yet they felt an obligation to want to volunteer for the US military to show their loyalty to the US. There were another 6,000 that were bilingual, very much like myself, born and raised in the US, but raised speaking Japanese. And so they volunteered actually even before the war to help the officers learn Japanese. They realized that there was going to be a war imminent with Japan, and so they wanted to prep themselves. So there was a language school in the Presidio that was teaching Japanese to these officers. And the Japanese Americans volunteered and served in that. And that was called the Military Intelligence Services, or MIS. There were many, many stories that you hear about for the 442nd and 100th. And the amazing one that I always like to share is the one about the Lost Battalion. There were 270 from the 141st Battalion. This was a Texas battalion that got separated from their main infantry. And they were surrounded by the Germans. Infantry after infantry tried to go in there and save them, but they all failed. As a last resort, they send the 442nd in there. 5 days of battle. At the cost of 800 injuries and casualties, they finally prevailed and saved 211. But who would go that distance? 800 to save 211. But that was what the Japanese wanted to do. Again, they were fighting two wars, one on the home turf and one in Europe. They are, to this day, the most highly decorated infantry for their size. 18,000 medals, and of those, 9,500 Purple Hearts. Just courageous. And I've had the opportunity to meet several of these folks, and it's just amazing to hear their stories. And it's what really makes me proud to be an American, right? Mike talked about this earlier. We have to recognize our veterans. And Tom Graves has come to JAMsj and talked about his speaking to veterans. And it's just, again, amazing, touching stories. And there are far more stories that I would love to share, but just don't have the time. One of the things that I always tell students when they come to the museum and I have an opportunity to take them through is that we're all going to run into problems and challenges throughout our lives. But think of the bamboo that we have growing in our yards. Have you ever had bamboo grow? God, that stuff is so resilient. But it's like our souls. You think about all the troubles and challenges we're having now in this pandemic, but think of the bamboo. No matter what winds, what storms hit it, it still pops right back. And I think a lot of us have that same type of mentality, and we have to persevere. And what I want to share with you today is that history has to be remembered. And the reason why is because if you forget it, it has a tendency to repeat itself. And that's where the Japanese American Museum comes in. Our mission is to CPS, collect, preserve, and share the Japanese American history, culture, and arts with the Greater Bay Area. And I hope to have you come visit someday. It's a 6,400 square foot building, 2 stories. This picture on the left top is the exterior view from the street. And it's been fashioned after a farm building. The lower left, is the barracks that's been replicated. It's built to spec. Everything about it is literally to spec. Jimmy Yamichi, who is our curator, who passed away a few years ago, was at Tule Lake. And so we fashioned this exactly like he remembers it. And he was one of the shop foremans there. And so he brought blueprints back. So when we built this museum, we made sure that we had the space for it, and we built it exactly to his memory and specs. It's a one-of-a-kind gem, and we welcome you to come visit it. We also have the largest collection of farm equipment from that era in a 2,400 square foot backlot. And then, of course, all the incarceration stories. But this is all made possible because of the wonderful volunteers and the community that pulls together and volunteers there. One of the things we talk about is the culture and why it's important to preserve that culture. I mean, we all have our uniquenesses. In the Japanese spirit of things, we talk about perseverance, we talk about gamma, we talk about kind of fitting in with everybody else and being sensitive to our surroundings. We say ki o tsukaimasu, which means to be aware of your surroundings. If you've ever been to Tokyo, and I know some of you are looking forward to making that trip, I know Anastasia talked about that. Well, someday I hope you go visit, and you'll find Tokyo is an amazing city with enormous amount of people, yet they are able to coexist. And I think it's that being aware of your surroundings and keeping up with tradition. It's the funniest thing. Whenever we have a potluck at the museum, we always have more food than not enough. And there's always opportunity for people to bring back food. But the thing that always strikes me is when it comes time to clean up, we never have to have a cleanup list. People just stick around and they always help clean up. And that's just one of those things that were instilled at a very young age, right? Help each other. And so I think that's one of the other reasons why I think the community is important, is for us to instill those cultures and those upbringings to our younger ones. I talk about culture. We today still honor and recognize Girls' Day. And it's Hinamatsuri in Japan. This is where they put out these beautiful collections. This one you're seeing in the center is the one that's been provided to us by the Consul General of Japan in San Francisco. They loan it to us every year. In February, we have this event where we take our rotating exhibit area and we transform it into a showcase for all the doll sets. It's just amazing. And then we also do what we call Undokai, which is Sports Day. It's in honor of the 1964 Olympics. And as many of you know, 2020 was supposed to be the Tokyo Olympics, been delayed a year, but they're going to still have it. And this is where we celebrate that tradition. And we'll have local community members perform. The very top is our own San Jose Taiko. We bring the junior ensemble in. To the left is our preschoolers, the Lotus Preschool. They do their rendition of Taiko. And then the lower picture is Nakano Sensei's Judo Dojo. Comes in and does a demo. And then last but not least at 3 o'clock is the Genki Kids performers. We do relays, have a lot of fun. And this is a lot of traditional games that we love to have the kids involved in. And speaking of kids, under a normal year, we would have 40 plus schools visiting the museum at a tune of about 1,500 students. And on an annual basis, more than 7,000 visitors to the museum. But during this pandemic, we've had to turn everything virtual. And so just like we are today, we have to Zoom our presentations. We have to Zoom our public programs, but we'll prevail. We also do an annual event within the community, which is the Day of Remembrance. This is in February. We have guest speakers like Norm Medetta come out and talk about their experiences and share again so that we don't forget history. And then we have other events that are like the Obon. This is an event in the summer. It's a big draw to the Japantown communities. And what it does is we block off 4 blocks and we dance, enjoy each other's companies, and celebrate this Obon festival. Unfortunately, last year they had to do everything virtual. And what that forced the community to do was think of new ways to adapt. And so they reached out to all of the nonprofits, gave us 30-second spots so that we could promote our businesses and organizations to let everybody know what was going on. Halloween is another celebration that we've turned into something that's kind of unique. If you look at these pictures, you'll notice that there are families involved in this Japantown Halloween. And the cool thing about this is, again, they block off 4 city blocks and the families come together. But we also have what we call the Golden Line. And this is where all the seniors participate. Bags of candy are donated to the seniors so that they can pass out candy to the young generation. And it's just such a great event. Taiko also gets involved. And we do a flash mob to Thriller, Michael Jackson's Thriller. And Taiko provides the beat. Again, it's a way for a community to come together, and we embrace it. Last but not least, events. The museum sponsors a winter boutique every year in November. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we've had to go virtual. So we've turned the boutique into an auction, and we provide spaces for all of the vendors and also the nonprofits in the community to be able to sell their wares for free. And that's just an opportunity for us to give back to the community, just like everybody else has been doing for us. And then in the month of December, we do what we call Mochitsuki. And this is an opportunity for us to pull the community together over several weekends and do 3 to 4 tons of mochi. And if you've not had the opportunity to have this little puck that's basically very dense rice, I encourage you to try it someday. It's great in soups. We love to warm it up, have it with a little soy sauce and sugar, and it's just a great little treat. But again, this is a testament to the community and the power of bringing people together and embracing our own cultures. Now, when we look at the future, we look at how are we going to sustain this Japantown? And this is a challenge I know I heard people talk about earlier. And it is a challenge because most of the folks that are in leadership are aging out. And so we have to look to the future to how are we going to preserve our Japantowns? And so we're really reaching out to the youth now. And so we have a program called NCI, the Nikkei Community Internship Program. And the wonderful thing about this is it spans all 3 Japantowns. San Francisco has JCYC, San Jose has JCCSJ, and LA has Kizuno. The 3 organizations take an 8-week span to co-moderate a program for the youth to instill leadership in the future of Japantown. And the wonderful thing is they get to know each other and they get to spend time together. And then for about 6 weeks, they work and volunteer at a nonprofit within their communities. So for us, those 8 weeks are precious because we always have a volunteer come to the museum. But we looked at that and said, well, 8 weeks is great, but what do you do after that? So the museum has given them all a soft landing by creating YPN, a Young Professionals Network within the museum structure to give them a platform, to give them a stage to continue on their journey and to fulfill more leadership roles. So that is what we're trying to do to preserve. And there are a lot of challenges that are going on. And I know people have talked about that during the introductions. And during this pandemic, it is definitely a challenge. And so what I encourage people, and if you think about the 3 things we talked about, the history, recall what Edward Siegel's talked about, right? The 10 R's. And remember, if you don't remember history, it will repeat itself. And then cultural, embrace the diversity that makes the Bay Area what we are today. And then the future is the youth and the succession planning. We have to make sure we instill the leadership in the young people. So my call to action to you, if you have time, I encourage you to volunteer at an NPO. It's amazing to get to know the community from the inside rather than from the outside looking in. If you're able to and you've got the money, donate to an NPO and they'll love you for it. No money, no time, it's okay. You have to dine sooner or later. And when you're able to do that safely, I encourage you to dine in the community. Help maintain it. I'm Michael Sera. I love my community. What about you? Back to you, Craig.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. Wow, that was amazing. You know, I am so, you are always so enthusiastic about JAMsj, and we picked up on that immediately when you first started coming to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club, and I can just see the enthusiasm. I think that is like your superpower. So thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing with us today.
Thank you. All I want to do is be Patricia when I grow up.
Can I tell you a secret? We all want to be Patricia when we grow up.
I mean, she mentioned it early on, right? I mean, I was so impressed when I saw her speak that I just had to follow her, and yeah. So that's why I'm here. She's the one who introduced me to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club.
Well, Patricia, why don't you go ahead and, I know you have questions.
Well, one, Michael, you don't want to be Patricia Fripp. You are the most amazing Michael you can be. That was a fabulous program. I mean, I spent most of the beginning part of your program, missed it up because the stories were so poignant. And it's just such a great example of what happens when people stick together through times of adversity. So one, I know Susan Rowan and I love museums, and we can't wait for a Golden Gate Breakfast Club day at the museum. So all I can say is congratulations, you did us all proud and your community proud.
Thank you. For coming from you, Patricia, that's an honor. Thank you very much.
Well, that was, what other questions do we have here? Joel, I see your hands up, and then Bert Hill. Oh, Joel, you have to turn your mic on. By the way, when it's time your turn to speak, everyone, just turn your mic off. We have them all on right now.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention, I also was a homestay, Janet and I were homestay parents for Japanese students. Our students went on to become PhDs and professors all over. But I think was the movie that had a big impact on me as a kid, and it was a long time ago, was called Go for Broke. Does Michael remember that?
I've seen it. Yes, there are so many movies, about the 442nd, and if you just Google it, there's an amazing collection of them, and there's been some more recent ones that have come out as well. So, by all means, Joe, there are many. Yes, and it's an incredible story.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for your quote.
Bert Hill, you're up next.
Michael, I just wanted to mention two of our most active troops in San Francisco are Troop 58 and Troop 12. Do you want to talk about them a little bit?
That's funny that you mentioned that. So, I was kind of in the early days, my brothers were part of Troop 12, which is the one hosted out of Pine United Methodist in the Richmond district. And, they would have these jamborees, and during the night before the jamboree, he would be putting this bag of stuff together. And I'm like, what are you doing? He says, it's for the rookies. And that scared the heck out of me because he would put corks in these bags and paint and all kinds of stuff. And basically what they would do is they would terrorize the rookies, and they would do all kinds of stuff to them. And that was part of the initiation. Of course, they outlawed that, luckily. But when I was coming up of age, I said, Mom, I'm not going to join the Boy Scouts because I don't want to have to go through that. And so I joined the Boys Club instead. It was a much safer route. But I'm very familiar with 12 and 58 because, yeah, they're a major part of the Japantown community as well.
Yeah, Troop 12 is, I think, it's one of the oldest troops in the United States, actually.
Yeah,
and
yeah. And so
they have led parades all around the United States. They're national. They're in terms of music, at least, whenever the Boy Scouts do something, they're right in the middle of it. And
yes,
both troops go back to Japan.
Yes. And Bert, a good buddy of mine who I grew up with is, now a scoutmaster, right? And he has a son that was in the troops, and we'll talk about those trips because they still go to Japan as a troop.
Who is that?
This is 58. I don't know if you know Elson Seiki.
Suzuki, not very well.
Well, if you know Japantown, there's a Seiki hardware store that was there,
okay.
And he's one of the sons.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah. You bet. Thank you.
Michael
Michael
has a question.
I don't have a question, I have a statement to make. Michael, one of my middle daughters actually is the founder of the anime club at St. Ignatius High School. And
very nice.
She took Japanese when she was an undergrad student at the University of California, Irvine, and has traveled to Japan. She loves Japan, and she goes to Japantown all the time. She is a occupational therapist now, and she lives in Los Angeles, but she's up here quite often because she has a contract right now with the Millbrae School District.
Have her come by the museum, Reginald.
I'll have her do that.
All right. Who else has got a question? Or I see Pete's got his hand up, and then Bill Buchanan, and then Elizabeth Glenn.
Thanks, President Craig. Actually, it's not really a question. It's more of a comment. In San Mateo and in northern San Mateo County, we have a very large community, Japanese American community. And in San Mateo, Central Park has a beautiful Japanese garden. It's well worth the trip. If you're ever down here, stop at Central Park, go to Japanese garden. It's really well done. It's beautiful. And there's also a memorial, a monument to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, just outside of the garden, sort of on the south edge, but it's there, you know, and it has the slogan, "Go for broke," you know, and yeah, so if you're ever in San Mateo, swing by, it's worth the time.
Thanks, Pete. And there's some great restaurants in San Mateo.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of good Japanese restaurants.
Yes.
Japanese.
So large. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And they have a you know, large contingency of community as well there.
Yeah, and in the Daily Journal, the little local paper here in Mid County, they had actually a story yesterday or the day before about Takahashi Grocery, who's a family-owned firm that's been in San Mateo for like 100 years. You know,
yes,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right, Bill Buchanan.
Good morning, Michael. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. It's also very timely. As you were speaking, I was sort of rolling back in time to my first experience, or first exposure, I should say, to Asian culture. And that was when my father, who was a career Marine, returned from the Pacific. And that was in 1945. He was involved in the invasion, or the assaults, I should say, on Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and those islands working on way up to, to the mainland. He came back, and a lot of veterans of the World War II came back with a cultural bias, a sort of a antipathy, towards Asian people. My dad was not that way. He saw it as a military contest, which we won, and he came back with some great stories because the 4th Marine Division was based in Maui. And so he came back with these great stories about Japanese food and culture and stuff like that. So that was my first exposure to the Asian culture. The second was when I served with 1st Marine Division in Vietnam in the 60s. And I came to admire the Vietnamese people for, just their all levels of their culture, their devotion to family, their religious devotion, martial arts, love their food, and physical fitness. They're all fit, And so I came back and actually I came back from Vietnam in '67. And about 6 years ago, I went back to Vietnam to tour the areas that we operated in. And, my admiration for their society was reinforced during that. And I had a friend at Oregon State. His name was Richard Oba. I'll never remember. I forget that guy. I mean, he was a lot of fun, great athlete. Anyway, here's where I'm working. This is what I'm working towards, Michael. One of the attributes that I really admire in the Asian community, whether it's Vietnamese or Japanese or whatever, is their devotion to scholastic excellence. And one of the things that really has concerned me is we hear about and see about more instances of actually notable academic institutions changing their acceptance rules to exclude Asian people because they're such students. They have this tradition of families and in the culture of achieving scholastic excellence. And that really ticks me off. Is there anything that, someone in your position can do to counter
that? Bill, I don't have that power, but I acknowledge it. I hear what you're saying because it's instilled in, I think, a lot of us, right? Is that you work hard, and if you work hard, it'll come back and pay back. And so that's just instilled in us at a very young age. And I think that's true for a lot of cultures these days, right? But yeah, I know particularly in Asians, that is definitely instilled in us at a very young age. And we see that because we see our parents working like they work their butts off. And so we don't want to have that for our kids. So we work our butts off. And then we get a generation and a generation, and then they kind of slough off. So I'm hoping that the follow-up generations don't slough off because that's the challenge we have. Yeah. Elizabeth? But thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Michael, for an excellent presentation. To follow up on Bill's comment, I think part of it, definitely there's a premium on the education, but also a lot of us don't realize that in a lot of other countries, you have a very small number of universities. So these kids really work hard to get accepted. And here in the US, we have a lot of universities, and we take it to some extent for granted. So that's you know, that emphasis we need to push much more for our students to accelerate their scholastic abilities. The other thing is, as I said, I'm in Los Angeles. If you ever have the opportunity to go to Little Tokyo, it's really a wonderful place. Good restaurants, good museum. It's and very dynamic. So thank you.
Yes. And to add to that about education, you know, the Japanese education system is very different. And they have to really, each step is a stepping stone. And it so much defines where you're going to end up in your career, depending on what university you get into. And they go all the way back to elementary, right? Because they're all feeding into the next level. And so those kids work their butts off at a very young age. And the parents spend an enormous amount of time and money in tutoring and making sure that these kids have the best education they know, because if they get into a top university, then they're set for life. And that's been kind of the tradition. But what it's opened up is parents are looking at that and saying, is that really the best thing for our kids? And so the US university system really opens that up. And I hate to say this, but I think the university system in Japan sucks. And the reason why is because they work so hard to get in. Once they get in, they slough off. In the US, it's hard to get in, but once you get in, you got to work your butt off to get out. In Japan, it's not that way. Once you get in, you're in. You'll get out. And that's the big difference, I think, in the education system. So most hardcore parents that have studied abroad and understand that will send their kids to US universities or abroad.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, Tim Durkin. First of all, the only word I can think of for your presentation was superb. Absolutely
Thank you.
superb. No wabi-sabi in that. It was perfect, which I do embrace the concept of wabi-sabi. One of the things that struck me, I had close relationships with Japanese businessmen when I worked for the Dallas Market Center and the Trammell family, was I learned that as far as education is concerned, there are no custodians in Japanese schools, that the children actually clean the entire building, not just the classrooms, but the hallways. And I have studied Aikido until just recently. And there was, it was known that every quarter, one of our entire classes would be to clean the dojo. And for the sensei, it had to be absolutely pristine, like my years in the Marine Corps helped me there. But it's remarkable that the students have so much responsibility, but they do it so willingly.
And Tim, this is an amazing story because you're absolutely right. And one of my clients uses that same principle. And so all of the employees clean the office and the toilets all the way up to the CEO. And the reason for that is because if you do that, then you care for it like it's your own, because it is your own. And so that culture is still there, depending on the company you work for. But one of my clients does that, because I remember going there one day and all of a sudden they're all cleaning their desks. And literally the employees were in there with gloves on and brushing the toilets. And I'm like, wow, what's going on? It's cleanup day. And so they still carry that through. And I think that's an incredible part of instilling that respect for everything you have. And that's what's admirable. So thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm. Tana Hope.
That was a great presentation. I actually lived in Japan for entire year. Between Osaka and Kobe area, and many people thought I was Japanese, but Koreans and Japanese, there are a lot of similarities and differences, and I really learned to enjoy and admire Japanese cultures and mindset. And it's so nice to see the efforts to preserve that culture, art, all that in outside of Japan, in the United States. So thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed
Tanya,
it.
thank you.
I
Thank
learned a
you.
lot.
Thank you, Tanya.
Anyone else?
Anastasia, you know what's wrong? Your background blends in, so they can't see your hand. But I'm going to call you out because you've been so patient. I've been watching you.
I've been like raising my hand.
I know. You know, your background is in the same color, so when you raise your hand, it gets blended in.
I see you now.
So, oh my gosh, Michael, that was so amazing and just brought up so many different things. Al and I, we were raised in Hawaii. So the Japanese culture is a huge part. We were there for the 60s and 70s. And Tim, your comment about the cleaning, it just flashed on me. Like, I was there in elementary school. Al's older than me. So he came in like intermediate high school. And we deep cleaned the classrooms as children all the time. And now I'm wondering if that was a Japanese influence in the schools, because I never even really thought about it. But I was raised on kikaida and you know, all those. In fact, Sunday mornings, the only thing you could watch on TV was the Japanese and Korean station Satana. I watched so much Korean dance on Sunday mornings. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Anyway, I had two questions. The WRA guy in Hawaii, can I have his name? And do you know if there was ever a book written about what he did? Because I think that that's really phenomenal. And I would love to know a little bit more about that. And then also, second question, my goddaughter is in Japan. She is teaching English to young students. And I'm wondering if someone, you know, outside of the area, especially now that everything's virtual, would she be a candidate for the YPN and the NCI programs? Do you have any idea? So two questions for you there.
So thanks for your question. I'll have to get back to you on the WRA. I know who the one in California or the West Coast was, but I don't know the one for Hawaii, but I can find out. So I'll have to get back to you. Anastasia, you'll have to somehow send me an email. So my email is michael@jamsj.org. So if you send me an email, then I can respond to that. And then your second question, so YPN is open to anybody that's interested in, you know, preserving the community. The only criteria, though, that we kind of lean towards is we're looking for locals. So San Francisco is going to be looking for San Francisco locals, San Jose is going to be looking for San Jose locals, and LA is going to be looking for LA locals. So that's the only thing that you have to be cognizant of. In this virtual world, you're right. But when we come back to reality, we want to have them be able to serve the local community. And that's one of the things that we look at.
That makes total sense. So, I mean, she's in Japan now. I don't know how long she's going to be there. But eventually, I mean, she's from Petaluma, so she would be back in the day.
Oh, nice. So when she comes back, and you have to, you know, bring her down to the museum.
Of course.
And I think, Anastasia, did I ask you about this before? Do you know Meg up in Sebastopol?
Meg who?
Miyatani.
No, I do not.
Okay. So she's a big, very active in the community there. And so I just threw that name out. But I know that she does a lot of exchanges with kids going back and forth between the North Bay Area and Japan. So I just thought I'd throw that name out there. But thank you.
All right, it's 8:53 right now. We have time for another question or two. Betty, I saw your hand up.
Thank you, President Craig. Michael, excellent and very informative presentation. I really learned a lot. Two comments and a question. In San Francisco at the Association of Realtors, and I might have mentioned this before when we were talking at one of our meetings, Alan Okamoto is who is an amazing man. He was the first president of the San Francisco Association of Realtors back in 1990, 1991. His father was not even allowed to become part of the board of realtors, which is just amazing. And Richard Sachs knows this story as well. And Alan Okamoto and another gentleman, John Wong, started an Asian Real Estate Association of America, of which I've been a member for years, etc. But he's just a gentleman and heads up the Cherry Blossom Festival in Japantown and so forth. The question I had as I was thinking when you were presenting is, how do you get, as leaders in communities or work or whatever, Our job is to bring and develop new leadership and new members. And I know that the Symphony League is trying to get new people. How do you get the youth in? And then you did answer that with the YPN movement, which we have in the Realtor Association as well. My question is, how successful is that? Is it increasing numbers of younger people getting involved? Is there apathy? What is that like now? Because that is so critical.
So Betty, thank you for the question. And Alan is yeah, we serve on multiple boards together. And so I know Alan really well. And he's just a great guy. But to answer your question, so YPN was just started this year. And the challenge I have, not the organization, the challenge I have is with like many boards, right? Nose in, hands out, which means, the tendency is to try to tell them what to do. And we have to avoid that, because if we do that, then they're going to just repel. It's just like raising our kids, right? The minute we tell them that has to be done this way, they just go the other way. And so what I have to, and I'm saying this because I'm guilty, because I always want to say, no, do it this way. No, do it that way. And I'm like, oh, I'm doing it again. So I have to keep my mouth closed. And I don't even go to the meetings anymore, because the minute I step into a meeting, I'm running the meeting. And that's not the way it should be done. So I'm trying to encourage the YPN folks to take the leadership role and to really be hands off. And it's a struggle, but I think that's the best way to do it, because they're smart and they're going to figure it out. They're going to fail a couple times, but they'll figure it out. And that's the way they learn. I think that's how we all learned, right? It was through our failures. And so I think we have to give them a little bit of free rein and just know in our hearts that they will figure it out. But be there for them when they have questions. That would be my recommendation. And I'm Betty, I'm learning this right now because we're struggling through. Luckily the group is growing and we've got some good foundational leaders in there. And I'm trying to bring in more young, high potential folks into the group so that they get this wheel spinning in the right direction. But that's what you need, is a core group of strong young leaders that can kind of help steer the ship, and then hands off.
Wow.
Thank you. Great job.